Hello, I'm Greg with Primal Rights. Today we're going to talk about a topic that is heavily debated, widely discussed, and I tend to disagree with a lot of the conclusions that are drawn about it. And that topic is barrel wear. What makes a barrel wear out? If you've read any amount of literature, any amount of research on the forums or anything like that, you will be inexorably drawn to the conclusion, as most others are, that it is simply a factor of heat that wears out barrels. And the amount of powder and the bore diameter are the two most contributing factors to what causes a barrel to wear out. And invariably, the throat erosion that is caused by those two factors is what causes barrels to wear out. Now, normally I would put a topic like this in a article format and just do a big write-up with a bunch of pictures and everything, but this is one instance where I thought it was a really good idea to do a nice little video. And the reason for that is because everything that I'm about to tell you is nothing more than a theory that I have. It's not a hardened fact. Now, I'll obviously share why I've come to these conclusions, but keep that in mind that I'm not telling you something here that I can prove without a shadow of doubt. These are just things that I've kind of been drawn to logically over the years of thinking about this subject. Every time I heard someone talk about throat erosion as being the number one cause of a barrel not shooting well anymore, I was always just kind of stumped by the fact that I've had many barrels and have shot many rifles that had a extreme amount of throat erosion. There's one particular rifle that I recall didn't have any rifling for the first 4 or 5 inches in front of the chamber. It was the most extreme case of throat erosion that I've ever seen. Yet that rifle continued to shoot third MOA, half MOA groups, and seemingly with no ill effects at all on velocity or accuracy or precision. And ever since I started to experience those things, it made me question the common logic that throat erosion was what the most common cause of a barrel being wore out was. So I started thinking about the firing event. What goes on in that chamber? What's happening throughout the first few inches of that barrel? What's happening throughout the entire barrel during a firing event? And if you break that down to its core components, you can kind of see that maybe the explanations being given for why barrels wear out commonly is not exactly all the way right. At least I didn't think so. So when you have a firing event taking place, you'll have obviously heat. There's going to be heat generated. The propellant being burning, that little controlled expansion of gases that's going on in there is going to create heat. However, it is for an extraordinarily short amount of time. It is a microsecond. I mean, it's less than a tenth of a second, and considerably less in most cases. And the amount of time that heat is present in the barrel is by itself not enough to really cause a lot of heat. Now, secondary factors, right? You think about friction. The bullet is being squeezed through a hole. You can't take a bullet and just put a cleaning rod behind it and push it down the barrel, unless it's a cast bullet. You can do that with lead bullets and various different things, but a jacketed long-range boat tail bullet that we typically use, you're not going to be able to just push that down the barrel. It takes an extreme amount of force to get that thing to squeeze down through that bore and shoot out the other side. We think about the amount of friction that causes for a second. That is a tremendous amount of friction. Everybody knows friction causes heat. You take your fingers and rub them together really fast, it's going to cause a lot of heat. a tremendous amount of heat. And it's going to cause heat right on the surface of whatever material you're talking about. The point closest to the friction is going to be the hottest. So what else is going on aside from that? You've got powder, right? All the powder doesn't just instantly vaporize inside the chamber. The powder probably is acting like a sandblaster, right? As it's coming out of the mouth of that cartridge, it is essentially sandblasting the area directly in front of it as those particles are flying through that hole at extreme velocities. So you have that sandblasting effect taking place, in addition to the heat created by the sheer fire that's in there of the propellant burning, and then you have the tremendous heat created by friction. But what else is going on? Well, everyone knows how firearms function. The propellant burns, creates more gas than the space that contains it can allow, creates that pressure. That pressure then fires the bullet out through the barrel. Well, that kind of pressure, don't you think that it is expanding the barrel to some degree? Obviously, it would have to. 50,000, 60,000 psi is a tremendous amount of force. If you consider something like a scuba tank, 3,000 psi, right? Those things have to be inspected constantly because the pressure will invariably affect the composition of the metal. Now, scuba tanks are obviously aluminum or carbon fiber, significantly thinner than our barrel steels are, but the principle of a container that is under pressure is relatively the same regardless of what you're talking about. And it goes without saying, the shape and condition of the container and the amount of pressure it's put under is going to be different depending on the vessel. But in the case of a barrel, it's pretty obvious what's going on there. You've got 50, 60,000 psi, expands that chamber. As soon as the pressure starts building in there, that chamber, that barrel will have to start expanding. The bullet then begins its journey down the barrel. Obviously, the bullet's going to have to plug that hole in order for the pressure to build. Otherwise, you wouldn't really have any significant pressure. It would just poof right out the end of the barrel, and it wouldn't be significant at all. However, that plug in the barrel is what makes the pressure significant. Everyone knows if you jam a bullet into the lands, it's going to create more of a pressure spike. The pressure curve is going to be much more drastic at the beginning than it would be if you just jumped the bullet into the lands, gave it some momentum before the pressure actually spiked. So that plug, that bullet, as it's riding down the barrel, behind it is a massive amount of pressure. And that barrel is going to be expanding, and that expansion will ride that pressure wave all the way down the length of the barrel. Anyone that has ever even completed a high school level or even middle school level physics class or whatnot, you've probably done an experiment where you take a little piece of metal in your hands and you bend it back and forth. And eventually that piece of metal will get brittle and it will break, depending on the kind of metal that it is. Steel is typically very susceptible to that, where if you take a piece of steel in your hands and you bend it back and forth a bunch of times, not only is tremendous heat created as a result of that working action, but the steel will get brittle. It will no longer maintain its elasticity, and it will break. It will just simply snap right apart in your hands. A larger piece of steel than you could ever just tear or break in one fell motion, if you bend it back and forth enough times, it will break. So all of these things got me thinking a lot about those individual forces and what's at play. Exactly how and why the critical indication of barrel wear inevitably shows up. In every instance where I have seen a barrel that didn't shoot anymore, that didn't shoot well, there has been one factor that has always been present. If I take a bore scope in the front of that chamber, right in front of the case mouth, and just inspect the first few inches of throat in a barrel that has been shot out and is wore out, there's always one feature that I see, and that is fire cracking. Now, what's fire cracking is they call it heat checking, fire cracking, alligator skin. I mean, there's quite a few different terms for it in the industry, but essentially that is when you have all of these little micro fissures, and it looks like a dried lake bed almost. And you'll see that around the entire circumference of the barrel bore, and that will be for several inches of barrel, depending on what kind of cartridge it is. It may be extremely severe, or it may be just very mild and only the first couple 3 inches. But in large overbore magnums, it's not uncommon to see 8 or 9 inches, 10 inches of that fire cracking. So that aspect of fire cracking seems to be pretty well understood, as when you start seeing that, it's a very good chance that the barrel is well on its way to being done. When the fire cracking gets so severe that it starts holding a significant amount of fouling, then clearly your number of shots you can get between cleanings is going to be drastically reduced. But the feature is always there in a barrel that's shot out. I've not seen a barrel that didn't have something else wrong with it, that didn't shoot well, that didn't have that feature in it. So what then causes fire cracking? Well, common wisdom would suggest that it is just simply the amount of propellant that you're shooting down that bore. If the bore diameter is small and the amount of propellant is high, it will increase that throat erosion, and it's commonly held that the throat erosion is the number one cause of making a barrel not shoot anymore. And like I say, I've seen many barrels that didn't have hardly any rifling for the first several inches, if any at all, that still shot amazingly well. But they did not have fire checking. The fire cracking was not there. So that led me to believe that throat erosion was not necessarily the problem. It was the fire cracking. Well, I then looked for explanations of why is it that we get that fire checking. What is causing that alligator skin in front of the case mouth? Common wisdom, obviously, I did not agree with as to why that's there. Simply heat and everything like that. Reason being, you can take a blowtorch, a cutting torch, to a piece of steel of any variety, and you can stick it on there as long as you want, and it will never get that alligator skin appearance. Secondarily, if you look into the aerospace industry and you look at the stress testing that they do, most of the time to the point of failure on various different things, where they heat it up to extreme temperatures and then cool it down really fast, sometimes by even dunking it in some liquid nitrogen, you will never see that kind of fire cracking like that, just simply from heat. Now, the other aspect, friction. Well, could friction cause it? I think it's possible. It's definitely more possible than just the heat causing the fire cracking. So it's possible that you could have the severe amount of friction just by having that bullet be squeezed past there like that, that would cause it. But that doesn't really apply either, simply because the entire barrel length is subjected to that friction. And point in fact, the bullet is going its slowest closest to the chamber. So the friction of the bullet passing down the barrel cannot be the primary cause of that. If that were true, the end of the barrel would exhibit the most alligator skin and fire cracking, not the chamber area. So if that's not it, what are we left with? Well, the sandblasting effect of the powder. Can it possibly cause it? Well, I've been around fabrication shops my entire life, and you could take a sandblaster and hold that nozzle on a piece of steel as long as you want until you eroded a hole through the thing, and you will never see that fire cracking. You'll never see the fire checking at all at any point during that with just a sandblasting effect. And I mean, I've seen all kinds of media and all kinds of steel being hit with sandblasters, and that's just not an effect that you ever see. Okay, so that can't logically create that kind of alligator skin effect in the throat. So what are we left with? Pressure. We're left with pressure. So it comes back to that whole bending the little piece of metal type thing, right? The barrel is expanding during the firing event. That pressure is causing it to pop bigger than it is, right? That expansion and then the subsequent contraction as soon as that bullet leaves the muzzle and the pressure is relieved. Well, where is the pressure the greatest and at what time? It's always right at the chamber and the few inches in front of it. That's where you're having the most increase during the shortest period of time of pressure. If you look at pressure curves generated either by pressure equipment that's attached to a barrel or just even prediction software like Quick Load, you'll see that the first few inches chamber and the first few inches of barrel is where the significant spike in pressure occurs. Once it tops off in that first few inches, it's kind of steadily drops. The pressure is still causing the bullet to continually speed up, but the actual pressure curve itself peaks very, very soon in terms of the barrel length. It's right in front of the chamber is where you typically will have that spike. Now, jammed bullets obviously will change that equation. I don't really want to get into that in the course of this discussion, but a lot of that is common knowledge, and I agree with most of that, what the pressure is going to be doing in the case of jammed bullets and so on. But that expansion and contraction, that was left to me, in my mind, as the only real variable in this entire equation that could realistically cause that kind of damage in that location of the barrel. The expansion and subsequent contraction, the heat then of subsequent firing, and the friction that is generating the majority of that heat. As we said, I don't believe that the sheer fire, the propellant burning, can contribute as greatly as people think to the heat of the barrel, just simply because there's not enough time. I could take the hottest torch that I could come up with and pass it across the barrel for a tenth of a second, and just keep passing it across the barrel for a tenth of a second. And I could probably do that 50,000 times, 100,000 times. If I waited a minute or so between each pass, it would never heat up to the point where it would start melting the thing. No serious damage would happen to that steel as a result of that tiny fraction of heat. Now, compared to the amount of heat that's generated by the friction of that bullet going down the barrel, and you think of where that friction is the hottest, right? It's right at the contact point. Where do we see alligator skin? Right on the very surface of the bore, and it doesn't penetrate very deeply at all. So that is my firm belief at this point, that pressure is really the most important deciding factor of what causes barrels to wear out. Now, I know that I'm not alone in this belief. There are a lot of really intelligent people out there that have come to these same conclusions. I have searched high and low for articles on the subject. Haven't really come across anything not that kind of categorizes everything succinctly as I've laid it out here. But moral of the story is, if you've got a cartridge that has a significant amount of pressure, and more importantly, it has a very narrow period of time for which that pressure spikes, that barrel will wear out sooner than a barrel where the pressure curve and the pressure spike is over a longer period of time. These are just kind of common knowledge about how metals work. If you increase the pressure over a long period of time, chances are it gives the material time to adapt a little bit better than if you have the pressure spike over a short period of time. Now, I'm left to question why this hasn't been the subject of a white paper, why this hasn't been the subject of study for a multi-million-dollar laboratory. And the answer is as simple as what seems to be, to me, the logical reason why barrels were out in the first place. The answer why there hasn't been any definitive information provided on this is that it is irrelevant. My understanding of this, quite literally, is purely academic. There is no possibility that the things that I'm talking about here can dramatically affect what we are currently doing with our rifles, how we are currently doing things with our rifles. Now, with the exception of things like moly coating to reduce the friction in the barrel and so on, I have no doubt that this is a combined effect. What causes barrels to wear out is not simply pressure. The heat and friction that's created is also an effect, but they are secondary effects. Pressure is the primary one, I do believe. So, why hasn't there been a study? Well, it's not relevant. It's just not. Here's why it's not relevant. What do we do when we have a barrel that's shooting really good and then doesn't anymore? And we have a couple thousand rounds down the tube. We replace it. The how and why it got that way is insignificant. It's completely and totally irrelevant. We know through experience around about how many rounds we can get through a barrel. But we only think of that in round count, or some of the more advanced among us think of it in terms of time, in terms of seconds. A really good friend of mine, he has said multiple times that a barrel will last right around 3 to 4 seconds. And obviously that's a more universal answer than just simply saying round count. 3 to 4 seconds, that applies to all barrels, and regardless of chambering, because it includes the velocity variable in your calculation. But round count being significantly less universal, it's only per cartridge, per bullet combination, per powder combination. It's very specific to the set of components that you're using. Whereas the time, well, that's a better way. Well, imagine if what I'm saying is true, if it could be proven that I'm right and pressure is the most significant variable to barrel life, then we could actually come up with an equation that would tell us, based on X pressure and X bore diameter, X barrel contour, all of the variables around the pressure aspects of the equation, we could come up with a pretty solid formula, I think, that would be the most accurate way of predicting barrel life that we've had yet. I think that the seconds, how much time the barrel will last, is extraordinarily valid. But if we could come up with a formula based on pressure, then I think we could get very exacting if we account for the barrel steel and apply a little bit of experience to when we see barrels going out in different cartridges. We could sanity check that formula pretty easily, I think. Now that's a little above my pay grade. I'll leave that to somebody that has a little bit better grasp on math to come up with that formula. And I don't even know if I'm right or not. This is pure theory. And it's a theory that I've talked over with some extremely talented people, extremely knowledgeable engineers, and their first knee-jerk reaction when I ask them what is the number one cause of barrel wear, they will all say throat erosion. But once I explain my position as I've done here, they all think really hard about that. And so far, they've not been able to punch any holes in my theory. I have no doubt that there's holes there. But if it was this hard for me to find this information, chances are there's a lot of people out there that also would have a very hard time finding this information. And I felt it necessary to take this theory that I've been working on here for the last several years and try to condense it into a single video. Each one of these concepts could be talked about. Each one of these variables that I've discussed here could be talked about at length, and it has been the subject of countless hours of conversations with people that I view to be smarter and more experienced than myself. And so this is a very condensed version and a very, very compacted view of my theories and the most concise explanations that I could come up with. But again, I have to stress, even if we figured this out, even if we know unequivocally what causes it, the result is the same. When a barrel doesn't shoot anymore, you replace it.